Are you tired of being so paralyzed by overthinking and procrastination that you fail to achieve every single goal you set for yourself? In this video, we are talking about 5 lessons I learned from one of the greatest books I've ever read, Lessons for Living by Phil Stutz. Now, when I first read this book, I was trapped in a state of perpetual preparation, always feeling like I needed to learn more, know more, or have more before taking action. Of course, in theory, I knew this wasn't the case, but it wasn't until I learned about concepts like 2 birthday cakes, the philosophy of action, and other insights we're covering today that I was able to actually move from theory to practice. So if you feel like you are always getting ready to live but never actually living, prepare to understand why you're stuck in this cycle of inaction and how to break free from it. Each of these 5 lessons build upon the previous one, so it's important that you go through all of them and that you do so sequentially. Now, I'm Fran, a certified coach in high performance, integrative nutrition, and the neuroscience of peak productivity. I was trained by some of the world's leading experts in each field, and in this channel we explore how to take our mind, our energy, and our productivity to the highest level. Phil Stutz, whom you may know of from the documentary Stats on Netflix, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. He's one of the wisest men I've ever met, and he tells us that our culture denies the nature of reality. It holds out a promise that you can live in an ideal world, a world where things come easily, unpleasant experience can be avoided, and there is never a lack of immediate gratification. And to make matters worse, it suggests that if you do not live in this world, then something is wrong with you. But this ideal world is a realm of illusion. No matter how promising it seems, it does not exist. And denying the fact that life includes pain and adversity, that the future is uncertain, and that accomplishment of any kind requires discipline is the greatest obstacle between you and your success and life enjoyment. And of course, there is love, there is joy, surprise, transcendence, and creativity as well, but these never occur separately from pain, uncertainty, and constant work. So the first step is to embrace that a good life is supposed to be challenging. It's the hero's journey, and only after you quit arguing with reality and quit thinking that something must be wrong with you because you're experiencing life inevitable challenges can you start the process of becoming someone capable of growing from adversity instead of resisting and avoiding it. We'll go much more in depth on this in lesson number 5, but for now understand that, as Nassim Taleb says, a wind extinguishes a candle but fuels a fire, and there is a proven process we can follow to become that fire, so that it doesn't matter what happens, we have what it takes to use everything as fuel for our growth. And if you truly grasp this concept, you'll stop seeing failure as a bad thing, which will enable you to implement the advice from the lessons that follow. Which brings me to lesson number 2, the 2 birthday cakes. And the reason you're trapped in a cycle of inaction, always preparing and figuring out what the best decision you can make instead of actually taking action and moving forward, is because you are operating within a doubt system. And Phil uses the analogy of 2 birthday cakes to illustrate the mindset we typically operate with and the one we need to install in our head instead. So I want you to imagine 2 birthday cakes, each with a bottom, middle, and top tier. We might call cake number 1 the scientist cake and cake number 2 the philosopher's cake. So we'll start with cake number 1, the scientist mindset. The basic attitude of a scientist is to believe nothing until it can be proven, and only if there is outer proof does he accept any piece of information as true. Thus, the scientist always starts from the position of doubt, which is the foundation of the scientist cake. Now, the problem is that real life doesn't work the way a lab does. So we doubt everything until it's proven to us, until we're certain our efforts will be worthwhile. So proof is that middle tier, which leads to a false sense of, oh, I now know what I need to do. But since we can't eliminate uncertainty, and since we are operating from a foundation of doubt, we think something went wrong because that false sense of certainty quickly evaporates. So instead of actually taking action, we spend 95% of our time overthinking and getting paralyzed by analysis. So we might decide to focus on one thing, then doubt kicks in, so we try another thing, and so on, never allowing the compound effect to occur. So we stay busy all day but don't accomplish anything of value. Now, the people you admire, the highly effective and successful people, operate with a completely different mindset, and that's the philosopher's mindset. So if we take a look at the philosopher's cake, its foundation is faith, not doubt. And faith must be chosen. It cannot be proven. Attempting to prove it puts you back in the conventional mindset that thrives on proof. And look at how different this is, because the foundation is faith and the next tier is action. As we have the faith that our actions will yield something important, we take massive action. And that action leads to confidence, which is the top tier of the philosopher's cake. As Phil says, speed is a force, and confidence erodes as the time between idea and execution gets larger. He tells us that the right decision taken after a period of procrastination will erode our confidence more than the wrong decision taken quickly. And once you understand that feeling confident and powerful comes from taking action, but not necessarily successful action, but fast and decisive action, your whole life changes. So the message here is that you need to trust the process and you need to develop a sense of faith. And all of this might bring you to thinking, well, so what about knowledge? How will I know what to do? What if my instincts are wrong because I don't know enough yet? Phil dedicates a whole chapter of his book to answering these questions, and he kickstarts this chapter with a story from his own life, which we are going to see in this lesson number 3, knowledge versus wisdom. In the early 80s, a guy named Harold Benjamin created the wellness community. He had been so successful in his work as a real estate lawyer that he had retired and dedicated himself to good work. The organization offered psychological and spiritual support to those with life-threatening illnesses, all at no charge. The group consisted of Harold and 5 therapists, including of course Phil, which tells us that each time they got together, 1 or 2 good ideas came up, and then the therapists would discuss these ideas in a critical manner until they beat them to death. So Harold would wake them up by acting on the idea right now. He would literally pick up the phone and make a call, and Phil tells us that each time Harold reached for the phone, he could feel the room tense up. Each of the therapists thinking, you just can't do that. But he did, and by the end of each meeting, he would have a speaker or a consultant lined up for a new program on the schedule, which is something the therapist could have never done, as they needed to feel each step was the right step. In this process, as we'll see, Harold was accessing the power of wisdom, while the therapists were focused on knowledge. So Phil then tells us that we tend to think of intelligence as a thought process that goes on inside our heads, and he tells us that that's completely wrong. That's only the lower form of intelligence called knowledge, but there is a higher intelligence called wisdom, and this higher form of intelligence is not inside our head but spread out in the world around us. The will to take action is what connects us to this world of wisdom. Phil calls it the intelligence of the will, and to drive this abstract point home, Phil gives us a really practical example. Let's say we're planning to open a donut shop. We could spend hundreds of hours debating what percentage of the donuts should be chocolate and what percentage should be vanilla. Of course, if we take action and just open the shop, we will learn more about how many of each flavor to make in one day than we could in a whole year of abstract thinking. The world of donut eaters will give us the information we need. And that's the difference between wisdom, which is co-created between you and the environment, and just knowledge, which is something that goes inside your mind. And this philosophy of action teaches us how the result of any given effort is not important, given the fact that we learn as much from our failures as our successes. So the underlying message is that you need to focus on taking action, not on the results of those actions, because it's not about that. It's about the process that you are working by taking action. However, both of us know how hard it is to stay consistent and to keep moving forward over and over again. And this is where Phil tells us that we need an invisible structure that keeps us within this action cycle. And he helped us build this structure with the help of 3 disciplines, which brings me to lesson number 4, the 3 disciplines. To illustrate the power of discipline, Phil walks us through the following exercise. Draw a square on a piece of paper, and then draw a circle around the square, but not a smooth circle, make it a squiggly line. And don't let this circle touch any part of the square. The circle represents all the distractions in the outer world that can take you out of your discipline, and the square represents that invisible structure that discipline creates. And when you keep the circle from touching the square, you are not allowing the outer world to destroy your discipline. The square is that invisible structure that takes you toward your goals and toward your ideal lifestyle. Now, we tend to think of discipline as our ability to do what needs to be done whether we feel like it or not, and that's correct. but breaking it down into sub-disciplines instead helps us understand a bit better what we actually need to develop this ability of being disciplined. So this is where Phil's 3 sub-disciplines come into play. The first one is structural discipline, and we are going to be covering this more in depth in the last session, but for now it's worth pointing out that the fastest way to get out of a rut is to put structure back into your day-to-day. We are rhythmic creatures, and we are also in need to optimize our biology so that it works for us rather than against us. So we use this structure to develop habits and routines that keeps our mind and body healthy. And whenever you feel you are lacking discipline, you come back to this. Again, we're covering it more in the last lesson. Number 2 is reactive discipline. Reactive discipline is our ability to choose the most optimal response to the events that bombard us all day. It is not enough to have a structure and follow it. Stuff happens, and you need to develop your ability to adapt and grow from whatever stimuli comes your way. This is Phil's way of operationalizing the wisdom from Viktor Frankl when he tells us that between stimulus and response there is this gap, and in this gap lies our human freedom to choose the most optimal response. This discipline is all about getting in between stimulus and response, realizing that you have a gap in the first place, and then committing to choosing the most optimal response. And the last of these disciplines is expansive discipline. As Phil tells us not in this book but in his first book, The Tool, our infinite potential exists at the other side of our comfort zone. And expansive discipline refers to the action steps that you need to take in order to get out of this comfort zone and actualize your potential. This is the discipline of courage, of developing the willingness to act in the presence of fear. So if you want to cultivate expansive discipline in your life, you start by approaching challenges instead of avoiding them. Remember that it doesn't matter what happens, what matters is that you are willing to take action in the face of fear and uncertainty, and that feeling these emotions are usually reverse indicators that are showing you to move forward, to step forward into growth rather than back into safety. And all of this brings me to lesson number 5, which is emotional stamina. I first heard this term from my mentor and teacher Brian Johnson, who has worked with Phil for over 7 years. And Brian tells us that the most life-changing idea Phil has ever taught him is the one we are covering in this lesson, which is emotional stamina. So in their very first coaching session, Phil ended up by telling Brian, "You have a lot of emotional stamina, perhaps more than I've ever seen." So in their next session, of course, Brian asked him what emotional stamina was. And Phil told him that emotional stamina is essentially your ability to handle life's inevitable pain, uncertainty, and hard work. And then he told him, if you want to cultivate emotional stamina, then you need to be the most committed to your protocol when you feel the worst. When I first heard this, it didn't sound like a huge revelation until Brian got me thinking more and more about it. And what do most people do when life hits them hard? They start doing all the things they know they shouldn't be doing, and they stop doing all the things they know are good for them. So what would happen if instead, when life hits you hard and you feel overwhelmed or scared and ready to give up, you somehow got yourself to fiercely dominate your protocol? If you did the things you do when you are at your best, you would develop what Brian describes as anti-fragile confidence, which brings us back to the quote from Nassim Taleb we introduced in lesson number 1, which is a wind extinguishes a candle but fuels a fire. You will become this fire, and everything that happens in your life becomes fuel for your growth. This of course presupposes that you have a protocol, which brings us back to structural discipline. And how do you build this structural discipline? Well, you start by identifying what is it that you do and what is it that you don't do when you are at your best. And you work towards making your prior best your new baseline by installing rituals, routines, habits then run on autopilot. So for instance, you might realize that when you are at your best, you go to bed at 10:30 p.m. So you might set a bedtime alarm to wind down and fall asleep at 9:30 so that you are asleep by 10:30, which is what you do when you are at your best in terms of your energy. And if the worse you feel it, the less you feel like doing it, the more committed you are to hitting your protocol, you'll build confidence in yourself. The confidence that it doesn't matter what happens, you have what it takes to use everything as fuel for your growth. And there is no greater skill to develop than this one. I specifically designed each of the lessons of this video to show you how to do so, to show you how to develop these skills. So as you move forward, remember that it is supposed to be challenging, that moments of adversity are reverse indicators to take action in the face of uncertainty if you want to create your best life, and that by building faith, wisdom, and discipline, you'll find that inner strength to grow from any adversity. So if you got to this part of the video, I realize that you you are someone serious about taking their personal development and productivity to the highest level, which is why I'm leaving you somewhere in the screen a video that will help you understand why you can focus. And it all has to do with 3 habits that are silently destroying your productivity and focus without you even realizing, and that you are most probably doing the 3 of them daily. I'll see you over there, and if not, a big hug, and I'll see you in the next one.